Hi everyone, my name is Ike Rakiecki and I'm a librarian in information services here at Mesa County. And what I'm going to be talking about today are the early post offices of Mesa County. And when I first got the idea to give this presentation, it was actually about a year ago. And I was just curious, a lot of the early post offices had interesting names, and in some cases there wasn't a whole lot of information. That was sort of reaffirmed as I really started to do research. Some of the post offices, there's a lot of information about. You know, some of those post offices have photos, some of them appear on maps and in newspaper articles. And in some cases, there's not a lot of information. I realized that at the beginning of the research, and then at certain times, I was able to locate more information. It definitely was a learning process. Doing this research was interesting, because I'm a Grand Valley resident. I've lived in Grand Junction basically my whole life. And there were a lot of these names of communities that I was just very unfamiliar with at all. Might have just been very obscure communities. It was interesting because you can go back and track the history of these post offices, and it is, in a way, it's a little bit of a summation of the development of Mesa County. There were towns in this area that aren't known right now, currently, as their first name. Olathe is an example of that. And so you had towns or little communities sprout up. Maybe their name changed. Maybe the community became abandoned and possibly became a ghost town. I guess that's one of the things when it comes to this kind of history, is that it changes over time. And maybe what we know now about our area is just going to change. There was a Daily Sentinel article from April 19th, 1987 that describes some of the early post offices in Mesa County. And it describes that there were 55 post offices in comparison with the 13 that are currently in operation. Some of those more obscure, or at least lesser known post offices were Clover and Hope, which were located near Colburn, Jones and Arlington, which was located near Grand Junction, Rocky, which was located near Glade Park, and Gavin, which was located north of Fruita. Pull up this slide. So what I have here is a little timeline of the post offices that I'm going to be talking about. You can see that in some cases, these post offices may have existed for a really, really long period of time. For example, down in the lower left-hand corner, I've got a note about the Ute Post Office, which became established in 1882. Eventually, though, after a short period of time, Ute was changed. The name of the post office was changed to Grand Junction. And obviously nowadays, we know that the Grand Junction Post Office still exists. Although originally it was not called the Grand Junction Post Office. I also have another note down in the lower left-hand corner about the Skyway Post Office, which was in operation from 1927 to 1943. The reason I've got a note about both those post offices is that they sort of fall out of the timeline. The timeline I have here is from 1882 to 1916. You'll see that some of those post offices, like Mountainvale, for example, was in operation for quite a while, especially when compared with some of the other ones. Mountainvale was in operation from 1884 to 1903, in comparison with Copper City, which was in operation only during the year 1899. Same sort of case for the Leon Post Office. It was in operation for just 1 year. Vega over there on the right was in operation for quite a while, though. So I thought this was just an interesting timeline to construct and to look at, just to give someone a sort of a visual cue as far as the existence of those post offices go. The next slide I have is was one of the paper forms that they would use prior to the establishment of these post offices. And the paper forms were going to name the post office, or the proposed name. It was also going to give you information on where that location was. Early on, say it's 1884, Grand Junction has only been around for a couple years, and a lot of these locations were very, very remote, out in the middle of nowhere. So what they would include on these forms is information like, where's the nearest creek, where's the nearest river, just so that they could get some sort of reference as far as, okay, where is this place located? You will see in some cases, this actual form is for the Ute Post Office. You'll see where it changed. So they may have had that original name, they would actually cross it out and fill in the new name. The form over on the right, or that next page, is actually going to show you a map of that location. Once again, depending on bodies of water or landforms or other towns that were nearby, it may be harder or easier to find or to determine where that post office is going to be. This is another list I was able to pull up in research, and it was the describing or listing the appointments of some of these postmasters and postmistresses. Just as a sort of visual idea of what some of these early post offices may have looked like, I was able to find a couple pictures. This first one is of the Colburn Post Office from 1882. This is a pretty well-established building. Some of the other post offices were not going to be, as quite from an architectural standpoint, we're not going to be quite as robust. Some of them might have been, a smaller cabin, could have even been something like a tent, possibly. This next picture is the Fruita Post Office from 1913. And this next one is from the Cameo Post Office in 1942. And the gentleman standing in front of the post office is a person named Joe Klemenek. The post office in Cameo at this time was also located in the sort of the company or town store. So not only could you come and pick up your mail, but you could also pick up some groceries or some food or supplies. This next slide is going to show us a map of some of the post offices that we will be describing. And I've got a little arrow pointing to the approximate location. So over there in the lower left-hand corner, we've got Copper City. Above that is Pine Bluff. Above that and to the right is Carpenter, Unaweep, Tunnel, Leon, Bernard, and Skyway. I was able to, in some of these cases, to find a more accurate or more detailed map of these locations. However, in some cases, I wasn't able to find a map or any sort of description with detail about where they were located. But I still had a lot of fun doing this research. So the first post office that we're going to be talking about was called Bernard. And see, there was a decent chance that it was named after Bernard J. Duffy, who was the postmaster of Molina at the time. It was located about 7 miles south of Colburn, and the community of Bernard was located on maps from 1910 and 1923. You can see the map we have here. It's a little hard to make out with the handwriting, but Bernard is located towards the right, sort of like center, middle right side of that square. You do see above, sort of above and a little bit to the right, where Colburn, the town of Colburn, is indicated. Another map from 1910 showing the coal and metalliferous areas does indicate Bernard just a little bit, basically south of Colburn. Nearby is Mesa, and then another community is listed as Snipes. Okay, so the next post office, another thing I want to mention about Bernard is that it was in operation between 1896 to 1905. So compared to some of the other post offices that weren't around for as long, 9 years is actually a pretty considerable amount of time, at least in my opinion. So the next one we're going to talk about is the post office at Carpenter. So that post office was in operation between 1890 to 1891. And the July 12th, 1890 issue of the Grand Valley Star newspaper indicated that the post office had been established and it would be served by the Grand Junction office. The first postmaster at Carpenter was a man named John Crozier. Built in 1890, Carpenter was a mining town for miners, coal miners, at the Bookcliff and Grand Valley mine. And it was located near a side canyon of the Bookcliffs, essentially to the north of Grand Junction. The town of Carpenter was founded by a man named W.T. Carpenter, who had moved to Grand Junction from Illinois, and he was, had his, a number of interests. He was a banker, businessman and investor. The town of Carpenter was actually renamed in 1892 to Poland Springs. The map that I've got here definitely shows Carpenter. We've got that little X. If you go to Google Maps, you can actually find a more accurate map. And what I've done is I've indicated the location of Carpenter with that little gold star. So in this case, the original map of the post office is a little bit hard to get that frame of reference, but thankfully we have more modern maps that are going to allow us to find out, okay, this is exactly where it is. So the next post office that we're going to talk about was the post office at Copper City. Now, this post office, you'll actually, if you can go back and look at those forms, it was then renamed to Ionia. But I would say that it's more commonly, that mining town is more commonly known as Copper City. And Copper City, the post office was in operation for just a short period of time, May 2nd, 1899 to October 1st, 1899. I want to just describe a newspaper article, or actually read it. I want to make sure that I get it as verbatim. There was a newspaper article on March 3rd, 1898, and the Daily Sentinel reported that a stagecoach loaded with passengers had made its way to Copper City. The horses pulling the coach were decorated with bunting, and the springs rose to the occasion and acted with commendable precision during the hideous journey. It describes that the passengers, once they arrived at Copper City, quickly began searching for suitable quarters. The main street at Copper City promised to be a thing of beauty and a thing of beauty to the public and a bonanza for investors. And overall, that newspaper article made it sound like Copper City was going to just be a great investment. You had the nearby mines, and it made it sound like Copper City was going to just take off. Right now, you might, if you're in that area, you might be able to see some signs of Copper City, but it would probably be a little tough to find much. Not entirely related, but in the February 11th, 1916 of the Delta Independent newspaper, an article described a Star Route mail carrier named Edward Martin. Edward Martin had helped rescue a Gateway resident named William Wagner. Wagner had fallen into an abandoned mine near Unaweep Canyon and had been trapped for 3 hours. The article describes Martin's sharp ears as being the main reason that the rescue was possible. I just wanted to include that, and it's an incident that took place near where Copper City was located. On this next slide, I've got on the right is a modern aerial image of the site near Copper City. And on the image on the left, we actually can see towards the upper part, we've got the old sites of Copper City. And so what I was able to do, I wasn't able to get an exact pinpoint, But if you look down on the map on the left, you'll see where you've got Nancy Hanks Gulch. And then on the map on the right, we once again see Nancy Hanks Gulch. So you can determine that Copper City was in that area, or in that general area. You're also going to see, the main reason for the existence of Copper City was the mines, and you're going to see a number of mines located around Copper City. The Hummingbird Mine and the Last Chance Mine, for example. Last Chance Mine was a copper mine. Another interesting point from the Daily Sentinel article about Copper City is that the initial petition for the establishment of a post office received 75 signatures on that first day. So there was definitely a lot of excitement at Copper City early on. The next post office we're going to be talking about is the post office at Harlow. Harlow was one of those post offices that there wasn't a lot of information about. However, I was able to find, based on those older maps, at least a map that gave you a general idea. The Harlow Post Office was in operation between 1890 to 1891, and it was located near Rapid Creek above Palisade. There's also a chance that it was located on the Harlow Ranch, and that ranch was mentioned fairly often in those historic newspapers. A September 1st, 1906 article in the Palisade Tribune discusses water rights, and it also describes the Harlow Ranch as possibly being one of the oldest ranches in the county. The next post office we're going to be talking about, just similar to Copper City, was only in existence during the year 1883, and that's the post office of Leon. We can see on this map, we're looking in the area of the Grand Mesa, you can see on the map we've got Leon Lake. I'd always personally sort of wondered about Leon Peak. A couple years ago, some friends and I tried climbing Leon Peak. We accidentally got the wrong mountain. But I was always just curious about the name Leon. You've got mountains like Uncompahgre and Sneffels. Leon just sort of stood out to me, and I was always sort of curious about where I got that name. The book Island in the Sky by Muriel Marshall talks about Leon Peak, and it mentions that Leon Peak was named in honor of a member of Ferdinand B. Hayden's crew during the Hayden survey. However, the book Grand Mesa and Plateau Valley History mentions Leon Creek, and it mentions that it was named after an early settler or trapper. Although Leon Creek may or may not have been located all that close to Leon Peak or the Leon Post Office, but I think that it's fair to assume that it was at least in that general vicinity. The book, the Grand Mesa and Plateau Valley History, also mentions that Leon Peak was named after a member of the Hayden survey. In the book Grand Mesa, World's Largest Flat Top Mountain, Leon Peak is included on an 1874 map, but no indication is given for why it received that name. So you've got, in this case, two pieces of information that are in some ways conflicting with each other. I guess that doesn't necessarily mean that one is right or one is wrong. It might just take a little bit more further digging or into any other books that might be out there. I guess once it all boils down to is that the Leon Post Office was in existence. It was most likely near Leon Peak or Leon Park or Leon Creek, and we can just stick with that for now. The next post office we're going to be talking about is the post office at Maynard. It was spelled M-A-I-N-A-R-D. I also found it listed or spelled as M-I-N-A-R-D on a historic map. And this post office was in operation from 1901 to 1902. However, it was renamed shortly thereafter as Loma. So while the community of Maynard may not be quite as known here in western Colorado, we definitely know where Loma is. The first postmistress at Maynard was a woman named Ira Jacob. And this next slide, I've got Maynard listed just a little bit to the south of Mac. Read my notes a little bit more. Okay, so the next post office we're going to be talking about was the post office at Mountainvale. So this post office was in operation between 1884 to 1903. And Mountainvale, at least as far as a location, is quite represented in newspapers from that time. And a lot of this probably has to do with the fact that it was around, or that it was in operation for 19 years. So you're talking about quite a lengthy time period when compared with some of those other post offices. There was a gentleman named Charles Dierich who is mentioned as engaging in the cattle business with Walter Wilhelmi. And that was in an article that was mentioned in an article on October 2nd, 1903 in the Daily Sentinel. And the reason I mention Dierich is that he was listed as a resident of Mountainvale. The two gentlemen were going to be joining in partnership in the cattle ranching business. It also mentions that Walter Wilhelmi, his partner, had recently sold his malt liquor business on Colorado Avenue. In the 1910 census, Dierich is listed as being a farmer and living on Orchard Mesa. In the 1920 census, he was living on Glade Park and working as a farmer at Mountainvale and being married to a woman named Marie Dierich. Dierich was a German immigrant who was born in 1876. As far as the location of Mountainvale goes, it was definitely up there in the present location of Glade Park or near that area. In the post office form, it lists the nearest river as the Grand, which would become the Colorado River, and the nearest creek was listed as the Dolores. A May 10th, 1913 Daily Sentinel article describes the discovery of petroglyphs and pictographs located 2 miles east of Mountainvale in Big Park. The discovery was made by none other than John Otto and 3 other individuals. The rock art panel was roughly 200 yards from the road that was being built for travel through Big Park, and there is a chance that this road, this historic road, was located during the present day D South Road, which will essentially take you from the Glade Park store across the Utah state line. You'll see the name Big Park appear regularly in newspaper articles. For a time, you'll see that Big Park and Glade Park were both used interchangeably. Obviously, we know that Glade Park, as a name for a place, replaced Big Park. The John Otto biography, Trials and Trails, includes a reference to a Big Park country. And the book mentions that the term Glade Park replaced Big Park in April 1910. However, you will see references in 1911 to both a Big Park and Glade Park. Another article on January 24th, 1913 in the Daily Sentinel describes work on a road that was being done to shorten the distance from Grand Junction to Big Park. John Otto, as can be expected, was heavily involved with that project. Early settlers had also named other separate areas that are now on, what one would consider to be modern day Glade Park. And those areas included Little Dolores, Beiser Creek, Coates Creek, and the West End. From a post office perspective, the Glade Park post office was changed as it was causing some confusion between another post office location in Big Park, California. Below is a description of the location of Mountainvale. And once again, I'm going to read from this script just so I get it verbatim. By going down the Trail Canyon Way, one does away with the old sandy road down the present road canyon. At Saddle Rock, the bad sand hill be abandoned by going below the rock in a straight line to Mountainvale on the Little Dolores. From there over to Coates Creek on the state line. And this slide is a USGS topo map. We've got the name at the beginning of that description. It talks about a trail canyon. Trail Canyon is located toward the very upper right-hand corner of that map. The road, which as we know exists now, due south, takes you from near the upper right-hand corner down through the sort of basically the middle and then down towards the lower left-hand corner. In the lower left-hand corner is where the Coates Creek Schoolhouse is located. And once again, you're getting really close to the Utah state line at that point. So at least with this map and with this description, we can get an idea that, okay, Mountainvale, well, it may not have been listed on historic maps that I was able to find. It was at least in the vicinity of this section of this map. Especially once again, we have that reference to the Little Dolores. Okay. So the next post office we're going to be talking about was the post office at Orson. Orson was in operation between 1890 to 1894. The nearest creek was listed as Plateau Creek, and the nearest river was the Colorado River. The book Grand Mesa and Plateau Valley History names two men named L.N. Shanks and C.L. King as being the individuals who started the post office at Orson. Orson was located close to the current site of Mesa, and it appeared on an 1895 map. The next post office we're going to be discussing was, once again, just very much like Mountainvale, in that it was located up in the current or present day location of Glade Park. So I had Pine Bluff, that's the name of this post office. Pine Bluff was on that first map that I included. That map gives you an idea. It shows that it was near the Little Dolores River. However, another map, which was I appreciate, it was being loaned to the library by a gentleman in the community. And this other map gives you a more accurate idea of where Pine Bluff was located. Sort of just slightly northwest of Glade Park. The book, once again, the autobiography, Trials and Trails, describes Pine Bluff and Glade Park as being two different communities. And a Mesa County oral history project, which was conducted in 1976 with a man named George Vern Wood, during that interview, he mentions Pine Bluff. He had farmed and ranched near Pine Bluff on the west part of Glade Park. And George Vern Wood also mentions that the post office had been staffed by a woman named Mrs. Sherman. On December 24th, 1914, the Daily Sentinel ran an article about the Pine Bluff post office and that it would be closing on December 31st, 1914. It describes some of the issues as far as having a regular mail carrier between Glade Park and Pine Bluff. The article also talks about the possibility that Glade Park residents would possibly have to retrieve their mail from Grand Junction, which if you think about it, in 1914, that wouldn't exactly have been an easy journey. Both Pine Bluff and Mountainvale were most likely, I'd say, located in the Dolores area, which was designated as a precinct for the Mesa County elections in 1891. The next post office we're going to be talking about was the post office at Ravensbeck. It was in operation from 1886 to 1888. At that point, it was moved, the post office was moved, and it was renamed to DeBeck, which of course we know as the modern town. The founding of the Grand River Toll Road Company was a driving force in the establishment of that post office. The Ravensbeck Post Office was the first store and post office between Grand Junction and Glenwood Springs. Mail was delivered on Tuesdays, and outgoing mail was sent out on Wednesdays by a stagecoach, which also carried passengers. The first postmistress was Marie T. DeBeck, and the post office was located on Dr. W.A.E. DeBeck's ranch below Virginia Mesa. Okay, so the next post office we're going to be talking about was the post office at Skyway. Similar to Mountainvale, that post office was in operation for quite a bit of time. It was in operation from 1927 to 1943. And I was able to locate a Palisade Tribune article from June 24th, 1927. It talks about the establishment of the Skyway Post Office and that a gentleman named R.R. Sisak would serve as the postmaster. The article also mentions that the Grand Mesa Post Office would soon be opening at Alexander Lakes. And the Skyway Post Office was actually located at Mesa Lakes. Another interesting bit of fact is that for a time, the Skyway Post Office was the highest elevation post office in the state of Colorado at roughly 10,000 feet. And Skyway was named for Skyway Drive. The Tunnel Post Office was once again one of those somewhat obscure post offices. And it was in operation from 1902, and it was located at a stop on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in DeBeck Canyon near the Beavertail Mountain Tunnel. It was located about 5 miles northeast of Cameo. And I brought up this, here on this next slide, a modern aerial image of Beavertail Mountain. And currently, nowadays, we know there is a tunnel there. So that post office was somewhere in that vicinity. But once again, it was only in operation for about a year. The next post office name was Uniweep. And it's interesting with Uniweep because there are actually two different sites listed. The first Uniweep post office was in operation between 1883 to 1890, and the second location was in operation between 1895 to 1898. That first location was located on present-day Orchard Mesa, about 5 miles southeast of downtown Grand Junction. The other location, later location of that Uniweep post office was in Uniweep Canyon. The next post office we're going to be talking about was Vega. It was in operation from 1891 to 1914, and it was located near the present-day location of the Vega Reservoir. An article that I was able to locate talked about an individual named Clarence Nichols who had moved with his bride to the nearby meadows. The couple would live in that area for 14 years, and Clarence Nichols was the postmaster at Vega for several of those years. So the last post office we're going to be talking about was the Ute Post Office. The name Ute, obviously we know them, the Utes as being a Native American tribe. Originally, the town of Grand Junction was Ute, but it was shortly changed to Grand Junction. And that's why you'll see the very first post office dating back to February 3rd, 1882 to May 26, 1882 as being Ute. Of course, then it was renamed to Grand Junction. That form describes the location as being located near the junction of the Colorado and Gunnison Rivers. It was the first post office, and it has clearly stood the test of time although it is not located in the original building. Grand Junction's first post office was located at 443 Main Street, and it was a log building with a canvas roof. To the left in this picture is Crandall's, one of the town's early stores. Crandall's, that building, also served as the Bank of Grand Junction, which was the first bank in town. Richard D. Mobley was the first postmaster at this location, and he also happened to have lived in the settlement's first building, and he was also the first Justice of the Peace in Grand Junction. The Grand Junction Post Office was upgraded in 1915 to the Federal Building, which we know still stands, and it was relocated to its current location on 4th Street after 1965. I've got an image here, a photograph from 1922 of the employees at the Grand Junction Post Office. And this next image is of the Grand Junction Post Office employees in 1960. That's it as far as my presentation goes. I hope that you found this interesting and informative. This next slide, this last one, actually is a list of references of books that I used for this presentation. Okay, all right, everyone have a great day. Thanks.